My name is Lila Morgan, and I wish I could say my life has been simple. But nothing about being the overlooked middle child in a loud, sprawling family ever is. For most of my adult life, I preferred the quiet corners, the kind people forget. I don't draw attention to myself. I work in the archives department of the local university, where I organize old manuscripts and handle boxes that smell like forgotten time. It's not glamorous, but it gives me peace. I've never been the type to chase the spotlight. So when I first met my sister's new husband, Derek, I didn't expect much more than polite small talk and maybe an awkward hug. But I never expected what came instead. He took one look at me, raised an eyebrow, then laughed too loudly and said, "Oh, this must be, her weird cousin or something." I remember blinking, trying to process if he was joking, or if I had misheard him. But I hadn't. My own sister, Madison, giggled nervously and didn't correct him. I stood there like a misplaced piece of furniture, wondering if it would be too dramatic to walk out of the engagement dinner right then and there. That night stuck with me in a way I wish it hadn't. Maybe it was because Derek didn't seem to be joking. Maybe it was because Madison had let it slide. Or maybe it was because for years, I'd felt like something in our family dynamics was tilted, like I wasn't quite in sync with the rest of them. I was used to being the odd one, but this felt like something else. Something colder. The wedding came and went in a blur of blush-pink table linens and champagne flutes. I smiled for the photos, gave a thoughtful toast, and stayed silent when Derek introduced me to his college friends as Madison's quirky cousin who reads Latin or something. Again, no one corrected him. I noticed the way his friends looked at me, half amused, half uncomfortable. I wanted to speak up, but I didn't want to make things worse for Madison. She seemed so happy, caught up in the fantasy of her new life. I told myself to let it go. Maybe Derek didn't mean anything by it. Maybe he just wasn't good with names. Maybe I was overreacting. Except he kept doing it. At Thanksgiving, I was the family historian. Every family has one, right? At their housewarming, I overheard him tell his business partner I was Madison's second cousin or something who's obsessed with dead people. I'd had enough. I confronted Madison privately, asking why he kept saying things like that. Her answer was a tired sigh and a forced smile. "You're just so different, Lila." He's not trying to be mean. "You're just hard to explain." That sentence haunted me for weeks. Hard to explain. As if I were a strange problem she'd learned to politely ignore. I distanced myself. For a few months, I made excuses to skip family events. I poured myself into work, digitizing letters from the 1800s and translating Latin inscriptions on university memorials. It was easier to focus on the dead than deal with the living. At least they didn't interrupt or misunderstand me. I thought I'd managed to fade into the background for good. Until Madison called me, breathless and excited, asking if I could join them for Derek's father's birthday party. "It's important," she said. "His dad is kind of a big deal in finance. It would mean a lot if you came." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I bought a new dress, wore makeup, even practiced small talk in the mirror. Maybe if I blended in better, they'd stop seeing me as the weird cousin. The party was held at a sleek private club downtown, glass walls, velvet furniture, everything polished to an uncomfortable shine. Derek greeted me at the door with his usual smirk and a mock bow. "Ah, the enigma arrives," he said loud enough for several guests to hear. "You remember Lila? Madison's cousin?" His father, a tall man with silver hair and a sharply tailored suit, turned toward me with interest. I extended my hand, introduced myself, and braced for the usual polite brush-off. But something strange happened. His expression changed. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. "Lila Morgan?" he asked, slowly. His voice had dropped an octave. I nodded. "That's a familiar name." He excused himself from the group and asked if we could talk in private. My heart pounded as I followed him to a quieter lounge in the back of the club. The shift in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, I felt seen, not in the way Derek saw me, as a curiosity, but truly seen. He asked me if I was related to Jonathan Morgan. I told him that was my grandfather. A quiet man who had passed before I was born, but whose letters and journals I'd spent years studying. The clubroom seemed to shrink around us as he exhaled, sitting back in the leather armchair like he'd been hit with a wave of history. He knew my grandfather. Not casually. Not as a distant acquaintance. He said they had worked together in the early days of his investment firm. That Jonathan Morgan had been more than just a brilliant analyst, he was the one who uncovered the fraud that nearly cost the company everything. He saved them. Quietly. Anonymously. And then walked away. I sat frozen, trying to reconcile the image of my gentle grandfather with the legacy this man described. He pulled out his phone, showed me a black and white photo of a young man in a trench coat outside a crumbling bank. "That's him, isn't it?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. And then he said something that shattered whatever illusions I still clung to. "You have no idea, do you? About the deal. About what he gave up." That night, I went home in a daze. I barely remembered saying goodbye to Madison or Derek. I didn't sleep. I pulled out all the journals I had from my grandfather, rereading every sentence with new urgency. I found passages that didn't make sense before. References to sealed letters, debts paid in silence, relationships severed for their protection. A puzzle I didn't know I was solving started to take shape. My last name wasn't just a footnote. It was a key. And somehow, Derek's father knew something I didn't. The next week, I returned to work with a gnawing restlessness. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. I asked my supervisor if I could take a few days off to focus on a personal research project. She agreed. I spent those days at the Public Records Office, the University Archives restricted section, and eventually, my grandfather's old neighborhood. What I found shocked me. He had indeed been part of the financial firm Derek's father now ran, but he disappeared from the records shortly after a major internal audit, the same audit that supposedly cleaned out corruption from the firm's founding days. Newspaper clippings mentioned whistleblowers, unnamed sources, mysterious departures. My grandfather had been the source. He'd uncovered crimes, saved the company, and then been erased from the story to preserve the firm's reputation. I found a letter, never sent, addressed to someone named C. Thompson, Derek's father. The tone was personal, raw. My grandfather had trusted him. But he also warned him that silence came at a price. He feared that by stepping away, the truth might one day get twisted or lost. That the name Morgan might vanish from the history books, while others took credit for his work. That his family would never know the truth. And now, I did. But what to do with it? I had no desire for revenge or recognition. I only wanted respect. To not be mocked as the weird cousin. To be seen for who I was, and for where I came from. I decided to reach out to Derek's father directly. I wrote a letter, measured, respectful, but firm. I included copies of the letter I found, excerpts from my grandfather's journals, and a photo of the two of them together. I thanked him for telling me what he did, and asked if he might consider including my grandfather's name in the upcoming history of the firm, which was being compiled for its 75th anniversary. I didn't expect a reply. I certainly didn't expect what came next. The letter I received a week later didn't just confirm the truth, it changed everything. The envelope was heavy, thicker than a simple thank you note should be. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was cataloging 19th-century shipping ledgers. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, the expensive paper smelling faintly of cedar and ink. Derek's father had written back, personally. His handwriting was neat, controlled, and there was something about the way he addressed me, Miss Morgan, that immediately struck a different tone than anything I'd ever received from someone in that family. He began with a memory. The day my grandfather walked out of the firm was a day burned into his mind. The internal audit had revealed layers of corruption buried deep beneath polished walls and smiling press releases. My grandfather had found it all: hidden accounts, fake audits, offshore payments, and rather than leverage it for power, he'd given the information to one man. C. Thompson. Derek's father. But the cost had been silence. In exchange for protecting the firm from complete ruin, Jonathan Morgan had asked for only one thing: his family's name be kept out of everything. He wanted to protect us, from retaliation, from media frenzy, from the powerful men who had built their fortunes on fraud. In return, he became invisible in the company's history, replaced in the archives by vague phrases like a team of concerned insiders. But now, all these years later, Thompson wrote that he regretted honoring that request so strictly. He said he'd thought he was protecting a friend's wishes, but he could see now that he had also erased a legacy. "Your grandfather," he wrote, "was the moral backbone this company didn't deserve. And you, Miss Morgan, seem to be made of the same quiet steel." He invited me to lunch, just the two of us. I accepted. We met at a discreet restaurant tucked behind an ivy-covered alley near the financial district. Thompson was different than I remembered from the party. He was still polished, but softer. He listened. Really listened. And after our plates were cleared, he slid a folder across the table. "These were supposed to be sealed until I passed," he said. "But I've come to believe some truths shouldn't wait." Inside were scanned documents, handwritten notes, and photographs. Letters between him and my grandfather. Minutes from board meetings where Jonathan Morgan's warnings had been debated. And a final note, and signed but clearly his handwriting, urging Thompson to remember what we did, and why it mattered. I felt like I was reading a secret history no one else knew existed. Thompson told me that the firm was about to publish a retrospective coffee table book for their 75th anniversary, a glossy collection of stories, interviews, and photos from across the decades. He wanted to include a full chapter on my grandfather. With my permission. I said yes. I didn't even have to think about it. Finally, after all these years, someone would know what he did. What we came from. What my name actually meant. But word travels fast in families. And some people don't like when the truth threatens their version of the story. Madison called me the next morning. At first, she sounded cheerful, but there was something forced about it, like someone holding back a scream behind their teeth. She asked me what I had talked about with Thompson. I hesitated, then gave her the short version. That he knew our grandfather. That he wanted to honor him. That I'd shared some of the documents I found. Silence. Then she asked, flatly, if I had told Derek. Of course, I hadn't. Why would I? Derek didn't respect me. He didn't even know I wasn't a cousin until recently. But the way she asked made my stomach twist. Because he's upset, she finally said. Really upset. He thinks you're trying to make a power move. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. A power move? I asked. For what? I work in an archive, not a boardroom. But Madison didn't laugh. Lila, she said quietly. Thompson's been grooming Derek to take over the firm. 4 years. And if your grandfather gets recognized now, after all this time, it changes the narrative. Derek's worried it'll make him look like a legacy fraud. That he only got in because of nepotism. I sat down hard. My mind raced. I hadn't even considered that angle. I didn't know, didn't care, about Derek's ambitions. But apparently, he cared a lot about mine. Or at least how mine reflected on him. Madison said they'd talked about asking Thompson to remove the chapter. What? I asked. But he's the one who, she cut me off. I'm just telling you how it is. Derek's talking to the board. If he can convince them that highlighting your grandfather opens the company up to legal risks, they might back down. I hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't sleep that night. My thoughts were a storm. I'd finally found the truth, finally had someone powerful willing to set the record straight. And now Derek, the man who once introduced me as the weird cousin, was trying to bury it all over again, to protect his career image. I didn't know what to do. I considered stepping back, letting it go. But then I remembered my grandfather's notes. The fear he had that his silence would become a kind of disappearance. And I couldn't let that happen. So I called Thompson. Told him everything. That Derek was trying to block the chapter. That pressure was being applied. He listened carefully, then asked me for something unexpected. "Come to the firm," he said. "This Friday. I want you to tell the board what you told me." My throat went dry. Me? Why me? He said it had to be me. That they needed to hear not just what Jonathan Morgan did, but what his absence had cost the next generation. I agreed. The day of the meeting, I wore a navy dress and a trembling kind of courage. I walked into the glass tower with my shoulders squared and a folder in my hand. Derek saw me from across the atrium. He looked shocked. Then angry. He crossed the floor toward me, fast, and hissed, "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. Just walked past him, straight into the boardroom. The room was large, with a long oval table and windows that looked like they belonged in a courtroom. Thompson sat at the head, nodding at me gently. The rest of the board looked up with polite confusion. I introduced myself. Lila Morgan. Not Madison's cousin. Not the weird relative. The granddaughter of Jonathan Morgan. I told them who he was. What he had done. How he had walked away from credit to protect the firm. I showed them his notes, the records, the unopened letter he'd written to Thompson years ago. I told them how I'd been treated, erased, like he had been. Laughed at. Undermined. No one interrupted me. When I finished, I sat down. The room was silent. Then Thompson spoke. "Everything she said is true. And it's time we honored the man who helped make this company possible." There were murmurs. Then a vote. Unanimous. The chapter would remain. In fact, it would be expanded. They asked if I would contribute an essay, personal, from the family's perspective. I nodded, too stunned to speak. Derek didn't look at me as I walked out. Madison texted me later that night, "You humiliated him. Was it worth it?" I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth. About legacy. About reclaiming something stolen by silence. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not overnight, and not all for the better. Derek's relationship with Thompson strained. The succession plan shifted. Madison stopped coming to family dinners. But something else happened too. People began reaching out. Colleagues who had heard about the board meeting. Researchers who wanted to quote my grandfather's notes. Students who thanked me for speaking up. And inside me, something uncurled. A sense of belonging. Not because others gave it to me, but because I claimed it for myself. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't weird. I was a Morgan. And I wasn't finished. For a few weeks, life shifted in quiet, invisible ways. The firm published a press release acknowledging Jonathan Morgan's contribution. It didn't make headlines, but within the finance community, it stirred whispers. People who had worked there for decades mentioned his name with quiet reverence, and a few old employees sent me handwritten notes, thanking me for bringing him back into the light. The company's anniversary book was still months from printing, but Thompson had already started talking about inviting me to speak at the formal launch. He said it was time people heard the story from someone who lived the silence. And yet, something didn't sit right. At first, I couldn't name it. I felt proud, yes. Vindicated. But also uneasy. A persistent flicker, like a candle in a corner I hadn't noticed. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just nerves or the slow shock of stepping out of the shadows after a lifetime in them. But then the first envelope arrived. It was thin, no return address, just my name printed in blocky capital letters. Inside was a copy of an article dated 38 years ago, from a defunct financial weekly. The headline read, "Firm rocked by internal scandal, senior partner exits abruptly." I'd seen the article before. What I hadn't seen was the margin, underlined in red ink. He wasn't the only one who knew. That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just a line that felt like a warning. I took it to Thompson. He furrowed his brow and read it several times. "Someone's trying to rattle you," he said finally. "Ignore it. There are always people who want to rewrite history their way." I nodded, but my gut whispered something else. I went home and began rereading everything again, my grandfather's journals, the archived documents, the letters. I noticed details I had skimmed before. Names of men who had disappeared quietly after the audit. Mentions of a sealed list that I'd assumed referred to clients. And one line, cryptic but firm, he said he would bury me if I spoke again. I dug deeper. I found court filings. Quiet settlements. A few whistleblowers who had vanished from the records after being relocated. This wasn't just a cleanup. It had been a purge. And my grandfather? He had chosen silence because the alternative wasn't just career suicide, it could have been something worse. I confronted Thompson again, this time not as a grateful descendant, but as a researcher. I asked about the list. He went quiet. Then admitted something I hadn't expected. There was another man, he said. Someone higher up. Untouchable. He pushed for the purge. Threatened us all. Your grandfather wanted to take him down, but I convinced him not to. Said it wasn't worth it. I asked who it was. Thompson didn't answer. Just said, he died 2 years ago. But his family, they still have reach. They won't like your grandfather's name being resurrected. That was when the second envelope came. This one thicker. A manila folder, inside a legal brief with my name on it. A private investigator's report. About me. My apartment. My workplace. Even Jessica's address, my closest friend since college. There was no threat, no letter. Just information. As if to say, we're watching. I froze. For the first time, I considered stopping. Backing away. Maybe letting the book print without the chapter. Maybe bowing out of the event. I called Jessica and broke down. She was silent for a long time, then said, "If they're scared of your truth, that means it matters. And you didn't come this far to disappear again." That night, I made a decision. I would go forward, but on my own terms. I stopped sharing updates with Madison. She still sent me clipped texts. "Derek says this isn't over. You need to be careful. You're hurting people who didn't ask for this." I stopped replying. Derek never contacted me directly, but he didn't need to. His silence screamed with entitlement. He built his image on being a perfect heir. I was ruining his backdrop. Meanwhile, Thompson invited me to a private meeting with the publishing committee for the anniversary book. When I arrived, there was a surprise guest. A woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a sharp gaze. Her name was Evelyn Harrow. Daughter of the man my grandfather had nearly exposed, the one Thompson had protected. She introduced herself with a cool smile and a handshake that felt like a test. She said she respected the effort I was making to honor my grandfather. Then she asked, delicately, if I had considered the consequences of dragging old shadows into new light. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. That her family's name was still on buildings. That their investments backed board members. That I was, essentially, poking a bear with a stick made of paper. I didn't blink. I told her I wasn't accusing anyone. I was telling the truth about a man who had been erased. If that made others uncomfortable, maybe it was time they felt what he had felt. She smiled. "You're your grandfather's girl," she said, standing. "Stubborn." And then she left. I expected Thompson to tell me to back down. Instead, he surprised me again. "That was a test," he said. "If you flinched, the chapter would have vanished. But you didn't. And that means it stays." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. The launch event came in early spring. A formal gala, catered with glass towers of champagne and sleek spotlights on easels displaying enlarged pages from the anniversary book. My grandfather's chapter was there. Full-page photo, glowing right up, my personal essay printed in bold beside the firm's seal. People stopped and read. Some took photos. A few looked over their shoulders before doing so, as if unsure whether they were allowed to honor him. Derek didn't come. Madison showed up alone, stayed for 10 minutes, and left before I could say anything. I noticed she didn't even glance at the chapter. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that strangers came up to me and said, "I remember hearing rumors." I always wondered what really happened. And now they knew. And I had given that to them. And to him. After the event, Thompson pulled me aside. Said the board had voted to create a new scholarship under Jonathan Morgan's name, funding students who studied ethics and finance. I almost cried. I thought that was the end. That this was the conclusion. But there was one final envelope. Smaller. No return address. Inside, a single sentence, typed. He didn't walk away. He was pushed. My blood went cold. I reread it 5 times. Then I turned it over. Handwritten beneath the typed line was something else. "Ask about room 12B 1985. It meant nothing at first. Then I remembered, one of my grandfather's final journal entries mentioned a meeting in room 12B. A trap, he had called it. A setup. A betrayal. I took the envelope to Thompson one last time. He looked tired when he saw it. He said the room had been a conference space. That it had been where everything went wrong. But he wouldn't say more. That night, I did something I hadn't done before. I called Evelyn Harrow. Told her I had more questions. She didn't hang up. Didn't threaten. She simply said, "Come prepared. And don't expect the story to be clean." I didn't know what I'd find. But I knew one thing, truth doesn't end where you think it will. It keeps unfolding, like a letter long lost and finally opened. And I wasn't afraid anymore. The Harrow estate was nothing like I expected. It sat on the edge of the city, nestled behind wrought iron gates and a wall of hedges that looked more like barriers than decoration. When I arrived, a security guard checked my ID, then handed me a visitor badge with no smile, no eye contact. As I stepped through the doors, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the quiet kind, but the weighted kind, like the house itself was holding its breath. Evelyn Harrow was waiting for me in a glass-walled library that overlooked a still pond. She didn't offer coffee, didn't make small talk. She gestured to a seat and said, "You want the truth. I'm not going to give it to you clean." I nodded. I was long past needing comfort. I just needed answers. She began slowly, carefully. Her father, Charles Harrow, had been the kind of man people feared even when he wasn't in the room. His power didn't come from yelling, she said. It came from knowing things about people, things they never wanted made public. And in the early 80s, when the financial firm was growing faster than it could regulate itself, Charles used that chaos like a tool. He moved money, covered losses, manipulated audits, and cut deals that would have sunk the company if ever brought to light. Until one man saw through it all. Jonathan Morgan. According to Evelyn, my grandfather didn't just find errors, he traced the patterns. He followed the money. And he approached Charles directly, thinking he could reason with him. That's when the meeting in room 12B happened. It wasn't a discussion. It was an ambush. A boardroom full of men who owed their careers to her father, all united in one goal: discredit Jonathan Morgan before he could go public. He was accused of procedural misconduct. His files were labeled incomplete. Internal memos were altered to suggest he'd fabricated claims out of professional jealousy. One man even swore, under oath, that Morgan had tried to bribe him. It was a lie, Evelyn said. She knew it because she overheard the planning. She was 16, hiding behind a door, trying to hear what her father was hiding from the world. But she never told anyone. Not then. And now, decades later, the only person left who had tried to stop her father was me. Why now? I asked. Why tell me this now? She hesitated, then walked to a locked cabinet and removed a thin black folder. She placed it in front of me. Because I can't carry it anymore, she said. And because you're the only one asking questions who doesn't want to burn everything down. You want the truth. He wanted that too. Inside the folder were documents I had never seen, and signed letters my grandfather had drafted to regulators, a hand-drawn map of fund movements across dummy corporations, and a transcript. Room 12B. It had been recorded, secretly, by a junior board member who was later fired and forced into silence. The transcript wasn't complete, but it was damning. It showed how they had manipulated the internal investigation. It proved that Morgan hadn't backed down, he'd been silenced. I took copies of everything. Evelyn didn't ask me to return them. She only said, "You won't be able to go back after this. Whatever comfort you have in your version of the story, it ends here." She was right. That night, I didn't sleep. Again. I reread the transcript a dozen times. I stared at the diagrams. I imagined my grandfather walking into that room thinking he could make a difference, and walking out knowing his name would be smeared unless he vanished quietly. And yet, he didn't destroy them. He gave Thompson the choice. He let the company survive. That was the part that stayed with me. He had the leverage. He just didn't use it. I called Thompson the next morning. Told him everything. Met him again at the firm. He looked 10 years older when I showed him the transcript. He read it silently, jaw tight, lips pale. Then he looked up at me and said, "I was in that room." I didn't speak up. I should have. But I was young. I was scared. And your grandfather told me afterward, if someone has to lose, let it be me. Just fix what's broken. And I thought I did. But I see now, silence doesn't fix anything. It just shifts the weight onto someone else. We talked for hours. About what could be done. About what should be done. About how legacy isn't just the good parts. It's the whole truth. The firm would release a statement, he said. A full one. The transcript would be referenced. Names would be redacted, but the facts would be made public. Not just in the book, but in the archive. On record. Permanently. He asked me to speak at the press release conference. I said yes. Again. The night before the event, Madison showed up at my apartment. She looked like she hadn't slept. She stood in the doorway and said, "You're going to destroy Derek's life." I didn't invite her in. I just stood there, quiet, until she added, "He lost the board's support. Thompson is looking at someone else to take over. People think he's a fraud. Because of you." I told her the truth. That it wasn't because of me. It was because of what Derek chose to do with a lie once he knew it existed. That his downfall was not my grandfather's redemption, it was his own resistance to integrity. She stared at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I always had been. Then she said, "I never realized how much like him you are." I didn't ask if she meant Derek or grandfather. It didn't matter. At the conference, I stood at the podium and told a room full of reporters the story of a man who gave everything to protect people who would never thank him. I spoke about silence, about legacy, about the cost of protecting power. I ended with a line from his journal, "The truth doesn't shine. It cuts. But it clears the way for light." It was published in every business magazine the next day. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't. Because the final twist wasn't about my grandfather, or Derek, or the firm. It was about me. 2 weeks later, I received a package with no name. Inside was a set of keys, a property deed, and a letter, handwritten on aged paper. If you're reading this, I've gone. And if the silence has ended, I owe you more than the truth. I owe you the future I could never give you in life. This was mine, quietly. A home I bought in case we ever needed to run. But we didn't run. We endured. And now, it's yours. Not because of what you've proven, but because you kept going even when the story said you shouldn't. It was signed, Jonathan Morgan. My grandfather. He had never stopped believing the truth would find its way. And somehow, through every twist, every lie, every locked door, it had. But I wasn't done yet. I visited the house the next day. It was tucked away at the edge of a sleepy town I'd never heard of, nearly an hour outside the city. There was no grand driveway, no security gate. Just a small cottage wrapped in vines, a weathered mailbox with the name J. Morgan etched faintly into the side. I stood there for a long moment, key in hand, heart aching with a kind of weight I couldn't name. My grandfather had prepared a place for us. For escape. For safety. For a life that never came. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The furniture was sparse but lovingly chosen, bookshelves, a handmade table, an old typewriter. In the back room, I found a filing cabinet filled with his writings. Not journals, not analysis. Letters. Hundreds of them. Most were unsent, never meant for mailing. They were addressed to my mother, to my sister, even to me, written before I was old enough to read, much less understand. Each letter was a piece of him. His fears, his regrets, his deep longing to protect us from the shadow he had chosen to carry alone. In one, dated the year before his death, he wrote, "If one of them ever finds this house, it means the silence has cracked. If it's Lila, I know it'll be Lila, then tell her she doesn't have to be like me. She doesn't have to disappear to do what's right." I cried for hours. Not just because I missed a man I never fully knew, but because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a footnote. I felt chosen. Remembered. The deed was real. The house was mine now. But more than that, it was a part of him he'd kept intact, unchanged by the world that had turned its back on him. In the weeks that followed, the story spread. The conference clip went semi-viral in academic circles. Universities started citing Jonathan Morgan in ethics courses. A small financial podcast did a multi-part series on the forgotten whistleblower who saved a billion-dollar firm and vanished. My inbox filled with messages, strangers thanking me, researchers requesting interviews, and people with similar stories asking how I found the courage to speak. But not everyone was pleased. Derek filed a lawsuit. It wasn't direct, it came through a third-party business holding, but the message was clear. He was accusing me of defamation, of leveraging fabricated evidence to damage his professional standing. His lawyers sent letters to the firm demanding an internal review. Thompson, already on edge after the public attention, called an emergency board meeting. I showed up with every document Evelyn had given me, the sealed letters, the dated notes, the property deed. I laid everything out. Quietly. Calmly. One board member, a woman who'd been skeptical of the publicity from the start, asked if I was doing all this for some kind of inheritance. Some power grab. I shook my head and said something I hadn't prepared, but felt more true than anything I could have rehearsed. All I wanted was to stop feeling like a ghost in my own story. There was silence after that. Then Thompson stood and said, "We're done here." The lawsuit was dropped within the week. No settlement. No apology. Just silence, Derek's final retreat into the corner he had created for himself. Madison didn't call. She didn't text. I heard from a cousin that she had started spending more time in California, that she was rebuilding. I hoped she found peace, truly. I had spent too long trying to earn her approval. I didn't need it anymore. Instead, I focused on building something of my own. The cottage became more than a relic. I turned it into a writing retreat, a quiet place for ethical researchers and whistleblowers to stay, rest, and work. I partnered with a nonprofit dedicated to corporate transparency. The first time I saw someone writing at my grandfather's desk, I stood in the doorway for a long time, letting the moment settle around me. At work, the university offered me a lead position in their archival ethics program. For the first time, I wasn't just cataloging other people's legacies. I was shaping how they were preserved. The anniversary book launched in hardcover, with Jonathan Morgan's chapter printed first, not buried in the back. His face, once invisible, was now the cover image, serious, steady, timeless. At the launch gala, an older man approached me. He looked nervous, holding a copy of the book like it might fall apart in his hands. He said he had worked under Morgan for a short time. That he had known, vaguely, something had gone wrong but had always believed the official story. "I wish I'd asked more questions," he said. "I wish I'd been braver." I smiled gently and told him the truth, "You're asking them now." And maybe that was enough. The final twist came on a warm summer morning, when I found one last envelope tucked between two of my grandfather's books. It was addressed not to me, but to whoever carries the name next. Inside was a single sentence, written in his precise hand. "Truth is a seed. It doesn't die in silence, it waits for the right soil." I taped it to the inside of the cottage door. So every time someone stepped into that quiet space, they'd see it. A year after the first dinner where Derek had called me the weird cousin, I stood in the same restaurant, not as a guest, but as a speaker at a leadership seminar on moral legacy. I opened with that story. I told the room how I was once mislabeled, dismissed, sidelined. And how a name I'd nearly been ashamed of turned out to be the key to a legacy of truth. When the talk ended, a young woman approached me. She said she had a complicated family history. That she'd always been made to feel hard to explain. And for the first time, she felt like maybe there was space for her, too. I took her hand and said, "You don't need to fit their story. Write your own." That night, I drove back to the cottage with the windows down, the air filled with the smell of wild lavender. I unlocked the door, stepped into the warmth, and smiled. I had found the truth. And this time I wasn't going to hide it.